Hi, I'm Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, and I'm very happy to be talking with Dr. Dan Weber today. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you.
Dan is currently semi retired, but he was the former senior scientist at the former Children's Environmental Health Sciences Center at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And he also served as the manager of the center's Neurobehavioral Toxicology Laboratory, a nationally recognized research lab that was at the forefront of utilizing fish as behavioral models of human environmental health. And most of the research involved the lifetime behavioral effects of early exposures to lead. He currently serves as a staff scientist with the Science Education Partnership Award Program at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee to develop elementary, middle, and high school science modules and to train teachers in the implementation of inquiry-based exploration. Well, that's his professional life. In his personal life, he attends both the Lake Park Synagogue in Milwaukee and Congregation Beth Israel near Ner Tamid in Glendale, Wisconsin, where he's also on the congregation's green team. He's a board member of Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light, and it's an organization working to address the crisis of climate change. He also has a fellowship with Green Faith, an international interreligious organization using faith to confront the issues created by climate change, and a past board member of Konfei Nesharim, a national Jewish group devoted to sustainable living inspired by the Torah. That's a lot. You are a busy man. Well, again, in the midst of all that, I appreciate you taking the time to talk today. I wanted to start off with the research that you've done. Could you talk a little bit, just briefly, about that?
Sure. So here in Milwaukee, one of the primary sources of poor health, particularly among urban children and inner city children, is lead exposure. For children, it comes largely from the ingestion of paint chips. And you would think, well, why would a child eat a paint chip? Interestingly, paint, when it has lead in it, actually has a sweet taste to it. In ancient Roman times, they actually used lead salts for seasoning because it gave a sweet taste to the food. And that's one of many sources of lead exposure that Romans actually got. But here in Milwaukee, particularly, and any industrial city, inner city children are heavily exposed to lead. So what we wanted to do was to set up an experimental model so that we could study some of the effects of lead in different kinds of exposure regimes. So, for example, if you expose it during just the embryonic stage to parallel what would happen with fetal exposure, or do you expose it during a juvenile stage, equivalent to maybe teenagers, and who are rapidly developing physically, emotionally, whatever, how does lead affect all of that? Or an adult exposure. So we have different ways in which we can expose these animals as models for what would happen in humans. And what we have found over the years, when we look at any different kind of behavior that we see in the fish, these are the exact same kinds of behaviors we're seeing in humans. And so we know that the fish becomes a really good model for what's happening. And we'll maybe talk about this a little bit later, but in some of the work we've done with high schools, we have a module where the students actually see the effects of lead on fish behavior. And when we did this module in an inner city school here in Milwaukee, the students, after a while, started pointing at the tank and saying, that's me in there.
Wow.
That they understood that the effects of lead on their lives was exactly what they were seeing in the fish, and they made that connection. It was a powerful connection. And with knowledge you gain, of course, you gain power. And that's the idea here, is that the students become knowledgeable, scientifically literate, and then they are able to do something with that information. So the work that we do with lead, and I worked with some other contaminants as well, but primarily I've worked with lead. The focus has always been to translate that into how can humans use that to empower themselves to take care of this issue that's affecting their lives.
Sure. Well, so you're a person of faith. I mean, I think you're kind of alluding to this a little bit right now, but how do you connect your research work with your faith?
It's actually really simple, and it comes from two different perspectives. How does science and the science that I do, how does that fit in with a religious perspective? And then how does my religious perspective and the life that I lead in that way, how does that amplify and support scientific type of outlook? And one would think that the two are two very different kinds of things. What we have to understand, first of all, is that science and religion are asking very different questions. Religion is asking, why am I here? What is my purpose? How do I behave and how do I relate to others? Science is not so much concerned with that information. Science is concerned with how do things work? How did it become the way it is? What are the processes in nature and in the universe in general that explain the kinds of things that we see now? So by asking different questions, we come up with very different kinds of perspectives. And yet to understand the world and to be able to act in this world, you really need both. You need to have both kinds of things. So for example, in science, what we look at is how do things connect with one another? Life is very complex, right? And so by sorting out these complexities, we see all the various kinds of interrelationships. Well, religion talks about that. Religion talks about it from a different perspective, not from the mechanics of these relationships, but how do we as people build relationships, not only with ourselves, but then of course with nature as well. Science looks at for example, how do species develop? And why are they there? I mean, what role do they play? And we scratch our heads and say, well, why would we want a mosquito? I mean, what purpose is that besides spreading disease? But yet we have within Jewish texts an understanding that every single life form, even the mosquito, has a purpose. Why? Because if God created it, then it must have a purpose. So we have this coming at different kinds of these issues from different kinds of perspectives, and yet there's this holistic understanding of how does the world work, what is our place in it, what is our purpose in it. So these are the kinds of things where I can put these things together and find that I don't see a contradiction between science and religion, but rather an amplification of each by being involved with both.
Well, it's interesting that that totally makes sense to me, and it's interesting that you put it that way because I think of that's sort of the theory, if you will, behind the Great Lakes Spirituality Project is this idea that um, the study of the Great Lakes, the experience of the Great Lakes, both scientifically and spiritually, complement each other, and one feeds the other and supports the other. Can you think of a time where an example of a time where you saw those two sort of practically complementing each other for you?
I would love to say that I understood that when I was a child, but that's obviously not true. But what I did as I'm growing up, yeah, I'm putting these things, not so much together, but building on them. So it's a separate path until at some point I do bring them together. I think the point at which I understood that there was a connection in the 1970s, I had gone to Israel. I was in college, just finished my freshman year. I went to a summer school program in Israel that particular summer. And what I did during that time also is I took a little trip around Israel, and one of the hostels, that's what college kids do, right? You stay in hostels, you don't stay in hotels. And so this hostel was located along a river just on the north side of Tel Aviv called the Yarkon River. And on the other side of this river was this huge power plant. The Yarkon River in and of itself was a very highly polluted river. It's polluted largely because of agricultural runoff. And then I had this power station that I was able to see near the river, and it was just belching out smoke. And I had this revelation that here in Israel, this land that I love, this land that I had imagined as being perfect, not only wasn't perfect, but somehow ran just head on in a collision which what I believed Judaism to be, to be a religion of life. And here was a dead river and air being polluted. And it affected me greatly that there needed to be a sense where these two things had to be brought together. That I, as a Jew who understood that life is important because God created it, God doesn't create trash. We may make it into trash, that's our choice. But God doesn't make trash. And we know that from the story of creation because, except for humans, every stage of creation is, and it was good. So creation is good, it is inherently good. And here we were making choices to do it. And so I had to put these things together somehow. And I think that point is where I began the travel, began walking on the path to try and understand, how does my religion deal with this, and how do I then act upon that understanding to do something to bring to connect what the science is saying that we're doing and what religion says we must do as moral human beings.
Sure. Well, you mentioned you wished you could say that when you were a younger child before that time in Israel, but I understand that your father was a biochemist when you were a
Right.
kid, and he
Yeah.
involved you in his work around studying the Milwaukee River. So I was curious about what it was like, sort of growing up around the Milwaukee River and studying, because you're from that area originally, and how would you describe your connection to Lake Michigan and its watershed?
So um, my dad didn't really study the river. He was actually a food biochemist.
Ah,
He grew up on a farm, and so you know, food was always, and growing of food, and um, making either food, whether it's food additives or making, whatever it happened to be, that was his focus. But he loved nature, and we lived just a block away from Estabrook Park, which is a county park um, in Milwaukee, and it was right along the Milwaukee River. And so frequently we would go down to the river. Um, and we would walk along it. We would identify birds, and I was always impressed with how many birds he knew. And we would learn how to skip stones in the river, and just get a sense of just being outdoors. And uh, so early on, I had the sense of that being outdoors was a value. It's not so much that my dad said, "This is a value, this is important." He simply did it. It's one of the things that was really very impressive about my dad, is that he never told me about, this is important, this is not. He simply, by his actions, I understood these are things that are important. Very early on, I became very interested in birds. In fact, that was, when I got to college, that was one of my goals. I wanted to become an ornithologist. Well, that didn't work. I went into studying fish instead. But that's another whole story how that one happened. But just this is appreciation. We would go camping at some of the state parks, and just enjoying being outdoors. Um, so I think that the most important thing that he did for me was to give me this sense of appreciation of just the beauty of being outdoors.
okay.
Um, so from that, from a kind of convoluted path, I eventually ended up, by the time I got to college, that ecology was the area that I wanted to focusing on.
Do you think growing up, not just near the Milwaukee River, but Lake Michigan in general, because you study fish,
Yeah.
do you feel like that had an impact on that sort of direction beyond just the idea that you were going to study ecology?
Um, Not fish per se, but I think an appreciation for just the beauty and the ability to use the resources that these two bodies of water could provide. Um, Growing up, I knew very well the Milwaukee River was polluted. You didn't go into the river. Um, and it sometimes it smelled pretty bad. Of course, as I was growing up, sometimes Lake Michigan smelled really bad because of the die off at that time of the alewives.
Sure.
The beach would just be covered with millions of alewives, and it would smell. Um, but uh, and that kind of seeped into my consciousness as well. Is that, what did we just do to these pristine bodies of water, that now we have these dead alewives and we have this stinky river that I can't go in to swim? And you could go back and look at pictures of the Milwaukee River around the early 1900s, and people were swimming in it, they were ice skating on it, they were rowing boats. It was a resource, a recreational resource that you couldn't use anymore. One year, just around the time when Earth Day was just beginning, I was still in high school, and one of the projects was going down to the river and just kind of taking water samples, stuff like that. And you would pick up the mud that was in the Milwaukee River. And the only animal that was living in this muck they were called tubifex worms. Tubifex worms can only live when there's low oxygen levels.
Mm.
A river with low oxygen is it's almost a contradiction, because it's moving water. It should have some level of oxygen in there. But that was really very impressive. I mean, these worms were the only living things that you could identify. So these are the kinds of things that maybe appreciate the complexity of our actions, that what we do matters, that what we do affects the quality of these two amazing resources, the Milwaukee River on one side and Lake Michigan on the other. And how do you pollute this large body of water to the point where you can't just take a cup of water out of it directly and drink it? That you've changed its structure so much that you have at least 80 plus species that are invasive that are in Lake Michigan alone, and that number increases yearly. Growing up here made me appreciate the resource. It also made me understand in a very focused way what we're doing to these wonderful resources.
You talked a little bit earlier about the perspective of the story in the first story of creation, and the idea that creation is good. So could you expand a little bit on the concept of how Judaism sees caring for the environment, or caring for creation?
This is going to be actually a long story. But we'll start with the story of creation first, and then we'll kind of expand upon that. I could probably talk to the rest of the time here on this question. But if you look at the story of creation, and whether one believes that it was written by God, or whether you believe that it was written by people inspired by God, what's the story itself, what it's saying is incredibly profound. The first thing it says is that creation itself is not chaotic. There's an order to it. And that order is really important. So for example, we're talking about water. Water was created before life could appear. Now, we could make all sorts of different kinds of creation stories, but if water comes first, and it was specifically said, and it was good, that means that original creation of this pure resource is inherently good. That is the state which is good. Any deviation from that, one would say, well, that's not so good, because that's not what God created. God didn't create a polluted world. God created a water which was clean. But because it was created before all life was actually then put into place, according to the story, what we also then understand is that water is necessary for life. The next stage of creation can't occur unless there's water there. And as scientists, we know this. When we're looking for life in other planets and other worlds, the question is there water there? That's always the question that astrophysicists will ask about when they find one of these exoplanets. Can we discover water? And if there's no water, we will assume that there can't be life. That may or may not be an appropriate assumption, but that's the assumption we as humans have, because that's our experience. And so even within the story of creation, we understand that water is life. It's called a midrash. Midrash is a rabbinic story. As a way to explain biblical texts or events that may be happening in people's lives, and try and kind of make this into a story to make it easier to understand. But in one particular midrash, and it's based upon Hebrew, which in Hebrew all words are based upon what's called a shorsh, a root. And in most cases, the root is 3 letters. Sometimes it's 4, rarely it's 5, but mostly it's 3. And there are 3 words in Hebrew which are really very important in terms of understanding this interrelationship that we have with water. Adam means man, mankind. It's also the basis for the word Adamah, which means earth. So then, of course, in the story, man is created from earth. Eretz is also 3 letters and means land. And Geshem is 3 letters and it means water, rain. Actually, there's a whole variety of words for rain in Hebrew, which is another, when a culture realizes that a resource is really important, they make all sorts of different names for it. Like the people who live in the tundra, they have hundreds of names for snow. There's different kinds of snow and all that kind of thing. Same thing with rain. And if you put these 3 words together, Adam, man, Eretz, land, and Geshem, rain, you put them together, you can kind of form a triangle. And that triangle already tells you that there's an interconnection here. And what the Midrash says is that without land, you can't have water. You can't have rain. Without rain, you can't have the land. It's sort of this hydrological cycle kind of thing. And then it goes on to say something really very important. And without either of those, you can't have man. You can't have Adam. So that there's a sense already within Judaism that without this holistic sense of the environment, of land and water being connected and being in a state which is whole, mankind can't live. So we have this as that basis too. We can also look at there's sort of 2 stories of creation. Okay, there's the 7 days, and where mankind is the last one to be created, and there's the second story where we start out with Adam and eventually with Eve, and then we go on from there. But in the second story, we find that God gives mankind a direct commandment, that it's l'shomra la'avda, to guard and to protect the land. That's our obligation. Western civilization has kind of transformed that into saying dominion. That's not what the Hebrew word says. The word says to protect and to guard, and yes, to work it, but to do so with a sense of respect. So that this too becomes a foundational aspect of what we have for this environmental ethic. Another part to this foundation of how Judaism understands the environment comes from the book of Deuteronomy, where amazingly enough, we're talking about what you can and cannot do during warfare. Mm. And one of these is if you lay siege to a city, you can't do, actually there's 2 things you can't do. One is you can't totally surround the city. You have to have an exit route for people to leave. Because if you're going to lay siege to the city, you can destroy the property, but the people have to have a place to go. They have to be able to leave. Okay. But the other thing that it's told is that you can't destroy the fruit trees. Interesting. What a great way to lay siege to a city. You get rid of their food. And that's precisely why you can't do that. Because the war is not so much to destroy people. There's different kinds of wars, that some of that are permissible, some of that are not permissible within Judaism. But if you do wage war, that you don't destroy the fruit trees. In Hebrew, it's called bal tashchit, do not destroy. And over the centuries, the rabbis have transformed this from just being a commandment as to what you do not do during war into something much larger about what you cannot do in terms of destroying. So that for example, if I have an article of clothing, I can't just throw it away because it still has use. That would be destroying something. As long as it has some value, I need to reuse it, repurpose it, recycle it, do something. I can't, if there are species in an environment that are endangered, I can't go out and just destroy them. I have to preserve. I mean, so this idea of bal tashchit takes on all sorts of different kinds of forms. And certainly it's going to take on a form when we talk about water. In fact, within Talmudic literature, the Talmud is this, this basically it's a conversation that rabbis had over hundreds and hundreds of years as to how do we apply the rules laid out in the Torah to modern life, what was modern for them. A lot of times these were case law that one of the Israel people who live in Israel would come to a rabbi saying, I have this issue, what do I do? Well, the rabbis would discuss this. They would make a case law out of it, and this would be recorded in the Talmud. One of the issues people would have is very often they would have farms along a river, and stuff gets into the river. Well, the person downstream would complain, saying, I didn't do this, I can't drink the water anymore. It's not even good for my crops anymore. What kind of recourse do I have? And so what the rabbi said is, if you live upstream, you can't dirty the water because someone downstream is going to be affected. So the sense of responsibility of the resource and how it affects people was already very much ingrained 2,000 years ago by rabbinical decree. So there's a lot of different issues that can come up with this in terms of what does Judaism have to say about the environment? It says actually a lot. And it deals with how do we treat the environment, not just as a resource, but as something that is special, as God created.
I talked with a rabbi recently for the project, and he had a similar phrase to that relationship with creation as it's translated in the first story or second story of creation. And he used the phrase to serve and preserve, and it reminds me a lot of what you were just saying. It seems to me that in order to sort of to carry out that to live in that perspective of that kind of relationship with creation, one needs to have a certain mindset. And I want to refer back to an article about you from a few years ago where you said, as a religious person, I'm an eternal optimist. I believe that things will keep moving forward. So it seems to me that if we have this kind of relationship with creation, that optimism serves us well, because if we weren't optimistic, we would sort of throw in the towel and say, hey, we
That's
can't,
right.
you know. But so I guess I'm kind of wondering, where does your optimism come from? Is it just from your reading of scripture, or is it some other approach that helps feed that optimism?
It's interesting that you recalled that piece that I wrote, because I have to change it now. And the reason why I have to change this, in terms of optimism and hope, there is a tradition within Judaism that you observe the anniversary of a loved one's death every year. And one of the ways in which you do that is that you give what's called a Devar Torah, words of Torah, sort of a little talk, which brings, it can be about the person, or it can be simply some kind of teaching that you do in honor of that person's memory. And so this year, it was the 12th anniversary of my father's passing, and so I delivered this Devar Torah during a service. And one of the things about my dad was that he always had this incredibly positive outlook on things. Didn't matter how bad things got, whether in terms of his job or the world or whatever, he always had this positive outlook. And I came across a quotation from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was the former chief rabbi of Great Britain. And he said there's a difference between being an optimist and someone who has hope. An optimist, as I had mentioned in this article, is that you just know things are going to get better. The person who has hope doesn't have that amount of certitude that things will get better. A person who has hope says, I will work to make things better. By my action, things can get better, but there is no guarantee of that outcome. But I have a responsibility to act. And that, I think, is what I need to rephrase what I had said before, because I'm less of the optimist than I am of someone who has hope, because I believe in action. There was a discussion that the rabbis had in the Talmud as to which is more important, study or action. Should I be the academic who simply sits and study, or should I be the activist? And there were debates on both sides of this argument. And eventually, the consensus built around that study is more important because it leads to action. That the ultimate is to do, but you have to know what you're doing. You have to study the issue. You have to uh, understand what are the foundational problems that need to be dealt with, and what are the options for possible solving of that problem. And we certainly could use some of that kind of attitude in how we deal with the environment. That we need to understand, that's the science part, and then we need the religion part, the moral values, which will then encourage us to do the action. So I need to kind of turn that whole thing around, that I'm a hopeful person, but I know that there's no guarantee that things will get better unless we do that action.
Well, and I don't mean to misuse this phrase, but as you're talking, it reminds me of that concept, if I'm saying this correctly, of tikkun olam, where yes, God created the world, but it is our responsibility to act on that. Um, and so hope comes out of a sense of we can make it better, but responsibility comes out of a sense that we should make it better, and it's our
Right,
job to do that. Um,
right.
so are there because you've worked with you have worked and you are working with a lot of Jewish organizations that connect, or interfaith organizations that connect with um, caring for the environment, caring for creation. Do you find stories in those experiences that help feed that hope, that shows you that action does make a difference?
One immediately comes to mind. There's probably other stories too, but this one I think is sort of a paradigm changing kind of thing. In much of the environmentalist world, over the years, that has taken on a more liberal uh, political type of bent to it for a number of reasons. But that has happened is that we have placed people into categories. You are conservative, therefore you're not an environmentalist. You are not on my side. And I had to have a head scratching moment with that one time, and I realized that just because you're conservative doesn't mean that you're not an environmentalist. We look back at Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, not necessarily the most liberal people either, yet he was, in terms of conservation, an amazing person. Other issues, maybe not, but on this issue, he was actually quite amazing. Um, Many of the founding people in the, as we're now beginning to understand, John Muir was a racist, and yet he founded a really powerful movement. So we have to kind of set aside and stop categorizing and kind of putting people into little bins, and kind of expand our understanding of it. So while I was on the board of the Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light, we had a discussion that what I was trying to argue is that we need to reach out to those who are on the conservative, the right wing, whatever terminology you want to use, because there are people there who do care about the environment. Maybe their approach is different and how they want to attack the problem is different, but they still are concerned about the environment. And this specifically for Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light, we're talking about climate change. And I knew that there were some groups, evangelical Christian organizations, that were particularly these youth groups within that, who were very much concerned about climate change. And so over the years, I kept pushing them. We need to reach out to them. We need to reach out and create a, a bond, because on this issue, we're on the same side. And sure enough, we finally did. And it was the synergistic kind of thing. So you're going to kind of need to expand and go outside of your very narrow paradigm sometimes to realize you have allies in places you didn't even think of. And that by doing so, you actually can make this uh, movement much more dynamic, much more widespread, and things will happen much faster. The other thing that also kind of amazed me, um, In the 1980s, when one of the sources of air pollution was sulfur dioxide coming out of coal-powered electrical power plants, and how to solve that problem. Most environmentalists and most liberals were of the opinion that you had to have strict government standards, and if anybody violated those standards, they got punished. In California, and I think was a Republican governor at the time, it certainly was a Republican idea, it was cap and trade. Let's use the marketplace to encourage companies to give an incentive to clean up their act. And it'd be an economic incentive, good for their bottom line, and everybody's win-win. And I remember that most environmentalists were against it. How can you rely on private industry? I was in graduate school, and I said, well, if I want to be a scientist, I know we have to run the experiment. Let's see what happens. So I advocated for it. I said, okay, let's try this. If it doesn't work, you tweak it, you redo it, you find something different, but you have to try it. Well, so California tried it, and their sulfur dioxide level dropped dramatically within a period of years. So it was ironic that when carbon dioxide became the pollutant du jour, that environmentalists started pushing cap and trade for that. And because they said yes, the other side had to say no, even though they were the originators of the concept. But I realized that you can't just keep thinking in your own narrow agenda and what you think is supposed to work. That you have to be open enough to hear other people's ideas. And if an idea seems that it has possibilities, then let's do the experiment. Let's try it, because if it works, we all win. If it doesn't, well, let's do the tweaking that we need to find out what does work. So these two moments, I think, opened up my mind, understanding that to broaden the base and to broaden the interest and the concern for the environment, we have to step outside of where we think things should be. We have to go outside the box. Just forget the box altogether. Just coordinate things and look at how things can work, right? By interacting with people of different backgrounds.
Well, I love that image of hope sort of coming from the idea that we can expand the community or expand our relationships and our connections with other people who share a similar concern. And I'm glad you brought up the interfaith power and light, because I wanted to ask you what that experience was like as a person of faith working with people from other traditions on a similar environmental concern like climate change. What has that been like? Can you, yeah.
It was wonderful, actually. Although I'm not on the board now, I've kept in touch with the people who are on the board, were on the board at the time. One of the things that has truly impressed me is that here we have people coming from all different kinds of religious backgrounds. We walk different paths. We have different rituals. We look at the world very differently sometimes. And yet, when it comes to this issue, we're coming at it from very different directions, but we all end up in the same place. And how we get there is very different. We have different assumptions as to how does the world work, and what do we mean by what's divine? What do we mean by what's ritually important? But when it comes to morality, and when it comes to how do you apply that morality to life and to the environment, we all end up in the same place. And that was absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, intellectually, I knew that would happen and could happen, but to see it in action and to play it out and be a part of it was absolutely a phenomenal experience. And that's why I am hopeful, because you see people coming from different places in life, and they're acting on a belief that the world is inherently good and we need to return it to that by doing things that are much more sustainable. And that is a real important take-home message for me personally, and I think for all of us.
Well, that's a great place to wrap up our conversation, that moment of hope. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today, Dan.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's been great having this conversation, and hopefully we can connect again in the future on this.
I would like that.
All right, you take
Good
care.
luck with your project.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.